Let's take a look at a voting method that we've only mentioned briefly so far. This is the voting method approval voting. The way approval voting works is that each voter is asked to select a subset of candidates, namely those candidates that the voter approves of. And then the candidate or candidates with the most approvals is declared the winner. Now, under approval voting, each voter is asked the question, who do you approve of? And then the voter looks at all of the candidates and decides among those candidates which candidate he wants to give his approval to, who he wants to approve of. And this question or this ballot should be contrasted with different voting methods such as board account that ask the voters to rank all of the candidates. So board account asks you to rank all of the candidates, whereas approval voting asks you a different question. It says, tell me which of the candidates you actually approve of, and you're allowed to approve of more than one candidate. Now, these two pieces of information, the ranking of the candidates and the set of candidates that you approve of, these are, you can think of these as different aspects about the voter's overall opinion about the candidates. And these aspects are related, but of course, they're not the same thing. So if I give you my ranking, for example, A above C above B above D, you can't tell just from this ranking alone which of the candidates are that I actually approve of. I might approve of candidate A, I might approve of just candidate A and C, and so on. Similarly, if I tell you that I approve of only A and D, you may be able to say, well, that means you somehow rank A and D above B and C, but it doesn't tell you anything about the ranking between A and D and between B and C. So these two aspects of the voter's opinion about the candidates are related, but it's important to recognize that they're just simply different information about the voter's overall opinion or preference about the candidates. What this means also is that when we talk about a voter approving of a candidate, that does not necessarily mean that the voter ranks that candidate first. So it might be that a particular voter only approves of his top-ranked candidate, but that's not necessarily so. It might be that you approve of more than just your top-ranked candidate. So, first question, why approval voting? Why should we ask this, extract this different information from the voters? So rather than running through the argument, I'll let you go to this website. It's a very nice website, and it contains a nice discussion of the main, most important properties of approval voting. There's also a video by Stephen Brams, the main proponent of approval voting, in which he clearly explains why he thinks your society or group should adopt or should use approval voting in the next election. Now, let's look at an example. So if we want to study approval voting, we need to represent each voter's approvals. We need a way of describing each voter's approvals. So the way we're going to do that is, for example, in this election, there are 4 candidates, A, B, C, and D, and 5 voters, and I simply write a 1 under the candidate if that voter approves of that candidate. So voter 1, for example, here approves of A, C, and D, but does not approve of B, or at least doesn't give an approval to B. Voter 4 here doesn't approve of anybody. Voter 5 approves of everybody, and so on. So now the candidate or candidates with the most approvals is declared the winner. So A has 2 approvals, B has 3 approvals, C has 3 approvals, and D has 2 approvals. So B and C tie. They're both declared the winners under approval voting. Now, one of the things that we're going to want to do is not just study approval voting, but we want to be able to compare approval voting to some of the other voting methods that we've talked about. In particular, we're going to want to know, how does approval voting method relate to those methods that elect the Condorcet winner, or will approval voting elect the Condorcet winner? In order to do that, we need more than just the set of approvals for each voter. We also need to represent the voters' rankings. So for example here, voter 1 has the ranking A above B above C above D, and this corresponding, that voter approves of A, C, and D. Now let's think about this. So note, voter 1 approves of A, C, and D. So voter 1 approves of A, C, and D. Now, I would like to suggest that there's something missing. There's something not quite right. This approval data doesn't match up correctly with this voter's rankings, at least if we assume that the voter is being sincere in who he approves of. And why is that? Well, quite simply, this voter approves of, for example, C. The voter 1 approves of C, but actually ranks B higher than C. So I said that the voter's approvals and rankings are different aspects of the voter's overall opinions, but of course they're going to be related in an important way. Namely, if you approve of some candidate, then naturally you should approve of all of the candidates ranked higher. So we're going to say that an approval ballot is sincere if, given the lowest ranked candidate that a voter approves of, he or she also approves of all candidates ranked higher. So, for example, voter 2 here is being sincere because voter 2 approves of candidate C, and then also all of the candidates ranked higher than that. Voter 2 approves of both B and C. Similarly, not similarly, but voter 3 here is not being sincere because voter 3 approves of only candidate B, but not the candidate D, which is actually ranked higher than B. So from now on, we're going to restrict attention to voters that are sincere. We're also going to rule out voters of the type 4 and 5. And the reason for that is essentially, if you don't approve of anybody, or you approve of everybody, then essentially you're just abstaining from your vote, because in this case you add 0 to everybody's approvals. In this case you add 1, but you add 1 to everybody's approval. So it's as if you didn't vote. So there's something somewhat, you might say, irrational about voter 4, because even if voter 4 doesn't approve of anybody, you might argue that it's always dominated, it's always better in some minimal way that the voter approves of at least your top ranked candidate. And voter 5 is just in effect throwing away his vote. So we're going to rule out voters of the form 4 and 5 as well. Now let's look at an example to illustrate how approval voting is connected to whether or not approval voting can elect a Condorcet winner. So in this election right here of 5 voters, candidate A is the Condorcet winner. You might want to pause the video and double check that I'm correct about this. And the first thing I want you to note is that there's no fixed voting rule that will always elect the Condorcet winner. And by a fixed voting rule, this is a voting rule that requires the voters to choose the top N candidates, or the top 1 candidate, the top 2 candidates, top 3 candidates, and so on. So vote for 1 is just a plurality rule that will elect candidates A and B, both tied with 2 votes. And so it's not guaranteed that the Condorcet winner will be elected. Vote for 2 ends up electing candidate D because 2 people, D gets 2 top 2 approvals. With 4 votes, D is declared the winner, but that's not the Condorcet winner. And similarly, vote for 3, A and B will be tied. Everybody ranks A and B either first, second, or third, so A and B will be tied. So it's not guaranteed that the Condorcet winner will be elected. So because of the flexibility of approval voting, in the sense that voters are not required to choose just the top 1 candidate, top 2 candidates, or top 3 candidates, we can, in this example here, actually guarantee that the Condorcet winner is elected. Namely, if the 4 voters in the first 2 columns approve of only their top candidate, and the voter in the last column approves of his top 2 candidates. Now, let's look into this flexibility of approval voting a bit more. Consider this election right here. There are 15 voters altogether. Note that A is the plurality winner, but 9 people rank A last, so A really should not be declared the winner. But both the Borda and the Condorcet winner is candidate C. So Borda and Condorcet agree. We talked a lot about their disagreement, but here they agree. Candidate C is who the winner should be. So naturally, many voting systems, many people would say that C really should be declared the winner. Now, what would happen under approval voting? Well, we've mentioned already that approval voting is very flexible. And what's going to happen is really just going to depend on how many people approve of their second-ranked candidate. So if we wanted, for example, candidate B to be elected, we would just need, so 5 people would definitely vote for candidate B or approve of candidate B because they ranked B first. And then if we just get 2 people over here to also approve of candidate B, then B would end up being elected. You could figure out a sequence of approvals to elect candidate A, to elect candidate C, to have A and B tie, B and C tie, A and C tie, and so on. So the flexibility here means, one way of interpreting that is that approval voting is very indeterminate because any possible combination of A, B, and C can be declared the winner under approval voting. So you may view this as a criticism of approval voting. On the other hand, I've tried to make a big deal that approval voting is actually asking different information from the voter. It's asking information that goes beyond the simple ranking. And if that's the case, if you take that seriously, then it's not that approval voting is actually indeterminate, but rather quite the opposite. Approval voting is very responsive. It's responsive in the right way to how the voters feel about their overall opinions about the candidates. So just to conclude briefly, I want to mention 2 ways that we could generalize approval voting. The first is to simply ask the voters to provide both a linear ranking, the ranking over the candidates, and also the candidates that they approve of, and you use both pieces of information to determine who the winner should actually be. There's a second, perhaps more interesting way to generalize approval voting, and that's to look at the grades or the type of ballots, the type of information you're asking from the voters. So first of all, note, there's a voting method called dis and approval voting. Note that approval voting asks you to approve of a set of candidates. But if you don't approve of a candidate, then you can't tell whether or not that's simply because you just don't approve of that candidate or because you actively disapprove of that candidate. You really don't want that candidate to be declared the winner. So dis and approval voting asks you to specify which candidates you approve of, which candidates you disapprove of, and then the third category in the middle is the candidates that you neither approve nor disapprove of. There's other voting methods, namely range voting and majority judgment, that they don't focus on the candidate, allow voters to express who they disapprove of, but they focus on the approval set, and they allow the voters to further specify their opinions about the candidates in that approval set. So the idea is that rather than thinking of voting for a particular candidate, you think of voting as asking the voters to grade the candidates. So you have a set of grades, for example, A, B, C, D, and F, and you give an A to the candidates that you want to approve of the most, and B the second most, and so on. We'll look at these methods, both types of generalizations, in some upcoming lectures.